Hey everybody, it's Dr. Reynolds again, and this week we're talking about Chapter 2, Phonetics, or the Sounds of Language. When we talk about phonetics, we're going to start with this idea of phones. So we're going to call each individual speech sound a phone. It's important to note that there's a finite set of possible speech sounds based on human ability to make those sounds naturally within the vocal tract. It's estimated there's roughly 600 consonants and 200 vowels that humans in different languages use. Obviously, each human language does not contain all of those consonants and all of those vowels. Instead, each human language will contain different sets of speech sounds. But it's important to note that all humans can learn to produce any human speech sound, as long as they have fully functioning vocal tracts. For example, when I was younger, I could not roll my R's. Then I married a Spanish speaker, and I have, through practice, learned how to roll R's. Obviously, some of these things, like other things we learn, are easier to learn when our brains are more flexible when we're younger. But it is possible to learn to make any sound in a human language. It's important also to note that not all sounds that we can make with our vocal tract are speech sounds. We can blow a raspberry, or blow our lips, and those are auditory vocal tract sounds, but they are not phones because they're not used for human speech. Articulatory phonetics is what we're working on here, and that's articulatory means how we articulate, how we make these sounds. And that is the physiological mechanisms of speech production. So what do we actually, our physiology allows us to produce these sounds, and we can connect them to particular sounds in our languages. So what we're interested in here is phonetic transcription. We'll use IPA in this class. It's the most widely used phonetic alphabet for linguistics, and it attempts to be a universal system for transcribing the sounds of speech. Remember that symbols in IPA should be placed in brackets to differentiate them from the spelling system of a particular word. And that is because these symbols represent the sounds, and those sounds can be represented differently in different spellings, and certainly differently in different languages. And so these symbols are universal and can be applied internationally to different languages. So symbols are tied to sounds which may be spelled in any number of ways in any number of languages. I.e., keep this in mind, spelling does not adequately represent the sounds of speech. Phonetic segments are what we're interested in because we're interested in representing each individual phone. And we think about phones as each segment of sound, okay? Like s, p, th, or these segments should not be confused with syllables, which has to do with patterns of sounds that we'll discuss in the next chapter on phonology. Each segment is also produced by coordinating a number of articulatory gestures, including jaw movement, lip shape, and tongue placement, which can be described as features, which we'll explore a little bit here, but more in our discussion of phonology as well. So as we look at those s, s, p, those sound phones, as they're written in IPA, you'll notice that they represent sounds and not letters, right? Important to keep that clear. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the vocal tract, how we produce sounds. All sound in the human vocal tract begins when we set air in motion from the lungs. We force that air from our lungs through our vocal tract. The sound source is the larynx, where you find the vocal cords or vocal folds. The filters or pathways for that air and sound are then the pharynx, which is the space between your vocal folds and your mouth, the oral cavity, which is your mouth, and the nasal cavity, which of course is air that passes through your nose. By thinking about the different ways that sounds are made through the human vocal tract, we can class those sounds or group those sounds based on phonetic properties that they share. The most basic division into sound classes are the two major classes, consonants and vowels, and a class that shares some properties of both, called glides. Consonant sounds can be further classified, for example, as voiced or voiceless, by place of articulation and by manner of articulation. So place of articulation, where that sound is actually made by your vocal tract, and manner is how that sound is made. Voiced and voiceless, we'll talk about in a minute. It is important to note that vowel sounds can be further classified differently from consonant sounds. They are classified by height, backness, roundness, and tenseness. And of course, we're going to look at all of these things. So think about consonants and vowels are two major kinds of sounds. Consonants are produced through the narrowing or closure of the vocal tract. We're going to talk about that. And they are typically less sonorous. They are obstruent. That means they're quieter and shorter. So if you think about some consonant sounds, t, p, b, z, all these consonant sounds, they're short, right? Think about vowel sounds, a, e, o, right? They tend to last just a little bit longer. And they tend to also be produced with relatively little obstruction in the vocal tract. So we say they're sonorous, they're louder and longer. And vowels tend to form the nucleus of the syllable, which we'll talk a little bit about here, but we'll talk more about in phonology. Glides may be thought of as rapidly articulated vowels, but they are rapidly articulated vowels that often are treated like consonants, okay? They move quickly to another articulation. So think about the Y in yet or the W in wet. So we make that y sound, yet. It almost sounds like an E. It's almost an E, right? Yet, yet. But still it quickly moves into the next sound, the yet. And wet, almost sounds like an O sound, right? Wet, as it rolls into the other. So glides are described in many ways like consonants, but they typically sound more like vowels, right? So we think of them as rapidly articulated vowels that act like consonants. So let's talk about some other kinds of classification. We can talk about voiced and voiceless. Voiced and voiceless applies primarily to consonants, though it is important to note that anything that's sonorous is going to be voiced, which means that vowels tend to be voiced. The space between the vocal folds is called the glottis. It's a little opening in there, right? Where we can open and close to form, to create different levels of obstruction in our vocal cords. When the vocal cords are pulled apart, air passes directly through without much interference, and the sound is said to be voiceless. So think about the sounds like f, or s. You notice how it kind of sounds whispery? Well, that's voiceless. When the vocal cords are brought close together, air passes directly, causing vibration, and that sound is said to be voiced, like v or z. So I want you to, on your own, right, and while you're looking at this, actually make these sounds. One of the best ways to understand phonetics is to make yourself make these sounds. I know it sounds silly, it feels silly doing it, especially by yourself looking at a book, but it can be very helpful to help you hear the difference between different sounds. So another way we can classify sounds is by consonant articulation. So consonants are articulated by obstructing airflow at specific places or points of articulation. So just as we can affect change in our vocal folds or vocal cords by opening or closing them, we also can do that in different places in our vocal tract, right? We can describe and classify consonants based on these points of articulation. So this is one of those fun places where it is to try to actually make your mouth assume the position that's described and see if you can replicate this sound, right? Start to connect the sound to the way you make these sounds, your articulation. So labial, anything that says labial is going to relate to the lips. Bilabial means both lips are engaged. So think p, b, and those are three very different sounds. P is a voiceless bilabial, and b is a voiced bilabial. The air, instead of then going through your lips, actually goes through your nasal cavity and creates a nasal sound, right? So three very different sounds created with the same articulation at the lips. Labiodental then is a combination of your lips for labio, your dental is your teeth, right? So you put your top teeth on your bottom lip and say f, or v. And that's once again voiceless, f, like far, f, and voiced, v, like voiced, right? You notice that once again we have two different sounds because one part of the sound is being changed way down in our vocal cords and the other part of our sound is being obstructed by our labiodental formation of our lips, okay? We can look just at dental. When we talk about dental sounds, we're talking about the relationship between the tongue and the teeth. When we say a sound is dental, that means your tongue is actually against the inside of your teeth. There are no typical English sounds associated with the dental. However, in certain areas of the country, particularly where there's French influences, you may hear certain sounds that we would usually use as alveolar, which we'll talk about in a minute, where your tongue is slightly back from your teeth, to make sounds that relate to a French T or a French D, and it's more dental. Interdental, though, does exist in English, and that's when your tongue moves between your teeth. So think about those TH sounds. So thought and the, right? Th and th. Once again, we have voiceless and voiced versions of that interdental formation. It's important to note that the voiced and voiceless, once again, comes from your vocal cords. The other part, that feeling of the air coming through your teeth around your tongue, is connected to the interdental. Alveolar sounds have to do with the tongue near the ridge behind the upper teeth. So say T, you should feel your tongue kind of curl up. Say T, T, or D, D. You'll notice those are complementary sounds. They're made in the same place. One is voiceless, one is voiced, or S and Z, right? Or or L. You should feel a part of your tongue either close to or touching the same place in your mouth when you make all those sounds. Alveopalatal and palatal sounds. Your palate is, of course, the roof of your mouth. And the alveopalatal is that space between your alveolar region right behind your teeth where it rises and where, like, as it rises towards the center of your mouth. And you can think of some sounds that happen there with your tongue. So say sh or ch or j, right? Those are sounds that are voiced and voiceless, where the center of your tongue seems to move up into the palate area of your mouth. In the roof of the mouth, then, we have a palatal glide, which obviously we've talked a little bit about glides, right? They tend to be sound a lot like vowels, but we classify them a lot like consonants. And so a palatal glide, like the Y sounded yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. You'll notice that your tongue is farther back in your palate. Velar then moves your tongue all where it's touching or near touching the velum, which is, if you reach back with your tongue towards the back of your mouth, you'll feel where the palate gets softer at the rear roof of your mouth. When it's velar, we can have k, k, or g, g. And you'll feel when you say those that there's vibration in that velum, or ng. And labiovelar means you're going to make that same kind of sound, but you're going to engage your lips as well. Wah, wah, what, right? Uvular then is that fleshy part that hangs back in the back of your throat. When you look and you say ah, and it vibrates in the back. We don't use that in English to make sounds, but it's important to note that not all the sounds we're talking about here, that these are English sounds. There's lots of other sounds that can be used in different languages to make sounds that actually add up to meaning, right? Pharyngeal is once again that area in your throat between the uvula and the larynx. There are no typical English sounds there. So the uvular we'll hear in French with a French R, that kind of in the back of the throat, ugh, sound. And that pharyngeal you'll hear in Arabic. It sounds like these throatal sounds. They are sounds of speech, right? Glottal are other sounds we make specifically from our vocal cords. And those sounds are like the H sound in hat. So If you say it, you'll feel it vibrate way down there, right? So pay attention, right? Practice the different sounds in your book and kind of see if you can feel where they are, because that'll help you understand how we're describing them. We're describing them in this case by how they are articulated, right? How they're actually formed in our vocal tract, where the vibration, where the sound comes from, where the air is obstructed. Another way we can talk about these consonants is talk about manners of articulation, which is another way to think about how we make sounds. So think about stops as sounds where the airflow stops completely, like p, like pat, right? P. We say stop. It just, right? It stops at that P, right? We have glottal sounds that do that. We have nasal sounds that do that. And so we think about the way in which our manners of articulation can combine with place of articulation to describe these sounds even more and classify them in different ways. Fricatives allow for the continuous of airflow through the mouth, like F would be like fast. It sounds like that air keeps blowing through. Or zoom, right? Zzz. That if you pay attention, you can feel the air continue to come through. Whereas when you say p, the P in pat, p, it's instant. It stops. Okay, it doesn't pull into the next sound. Affricates have to do with the slow release of a stop sound. These are like the CH sound, ch, like chip, or the often DGE sound, like judge, right? You'll see there's like it's a slightly longer than a stop, but not continuous like a fricative. It's called an affricate. Voice lag and aspiration are something to pay attention to. It will differ. A lot of these sounds can differ based on actual production of people in use. But these can differ because it has to do with whether you make a puff of air when you say something or not. So say the word puff. Do you go puff, right? Puff. Do you feel like a little explosion of air there? Well, that's an aspiration. And we can mark that with a little H to show that aspiration. We often see those with voiceless consonants that are stops. Okay. Oral versus nasal is an important thing. I mentioned earlier that is a bilabial nasal. That means when I close my lips and make that sound, the air goes, instead of trying to go through my lips, goes through my nasal cavity. So the air, instead of passing through the oral, passes through the nasal. And that is true of other sounds as well. Liquids are, we have different kinds of liquids. Liquids are interesting letters that have multiple sounds in our, or can be used in multiple ways, depending on if they're voiced or voiceless. And so we think about laterals as those L sounds, all the variants of L sounds. The retroflex R as the American R sound. It's important to note that there are lots of different ways that people say R's, though, even in America. And so, and the reason we use an upside down R is because we typically use the regular R symbol to represent the rolling R in languages like Spanish. And flaps, which we'll talk about more. It's important then to note that these laterals are different, or these liquids are different, because some liquids and nasals can actually act as entire syllables. In other words, they carry what almost feels like a vowel sound, like bottle, ol. That ol is just an L that is voiced, ol, right? But L's aren't always voiced. Sometimes they're voiceless, right? Like clip. Is it that L in the middle is voiceless. So when we have these syllabic liquids and nasals, we call them sonorant consonants. And finally, glides. So glides, remember, are rapidly articulated non-syllabic segments, like that W and J sound at the beginning of wet and yes, and there are others. Okay. So here's a way to kind of think about the different ways we can describe consonants in English, right? We can decide if they are by manner, a stop, a fricative, an affricate, a nasal, a liquid, or a glide. You don't have to worry about lateral and rhotic, except to know that lateral are those L's, right? Voicing, whether they're voiceless or voiced, right? Notice that all of our nasals, liquids, and glides are voiced, and the others each have at least one example on each side. Those kind of pair up by place of articulation, right? Whether that's bilabial, labiodental, interdental, alveolar, palatal, velar, or glottal. And way on the left there, you'll notice that it's we can break it up because regular consonants, typical consonants in English, are obstruent. That means they cannot become syllables. They are shorter and less loud, right? And sonorants are those ones that sometimes can carry the weight of a syllable because it almost sounds like they include a vowel with them. We spend a lot of time on consonants. Vowels, luckily, are much easier, much simpler to classify. There aren't as many vowels. But vowel sounds can be further classified by tongue movement based on height or backness, so the place in where your tongue is when you say that vowel. Lip shape, roundness, and vocal tract constriction. We call that tenseness. Okay, so vowels then can be described as follows. It can be high, mid, or low. Is your tongue high in your oral cavity, in the middle of your oral cavity, or low? Say the word low, and you can feel your tongue drop down, right? High feels kind of low as well, right? Mid feels a little bit middle, right? We can have front, back central, or back, where your tongue once again goes. And then whether your lips are rounded or unrounded. So think about E versus O. Right, very different. E is very unrounded. O is very rounded. Intense or lax. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So vowels can also be described as simple. That is, they show no noticeable change in quality within a single syllable. Those are kind of your standard basic vowel sounds. Or they can be diphthongs. And diphthongs are either major or minor, and they exhibit a change in quality that seems to glide between two sounds in a single syllable. So a diphthong might be something like buy. So when you buy something, right, that I sound, notice that it's, if you pay attention to it, it feels like it's two different sounds, but we still have one syllable. Those sounds glide together. We don't say buy, right? We say buy. But if you feel it slide in your mouth. You feel your tongue move, buy, right? As your tongue rises in your mouth, okay? And that would be a major diphthong. It's really easy to distinguish. There are ones that are less noticeable. So like they, right? If we really accentuate it, they, right? But we say they. And it almost feels like it's just one simple vowel. But if you pay attention, we see they, right? There's a little E on the end, right? And so we wanted to be able to describe that. So there's ways to describe those vowels as well. And here we see them, okay? So these are our different vowel sounds in English, including the diphthongs. The diphthongs are the ones that are represented by two symbols, okay? And once again, what you want to do is look at your chart and look at the words that they are the example words. So you might look at the one that looks like an lowercase I, right? The I with a dot on it, and the top says it's front high. Well, that's that E, like she, cream, believe, receive, serene, amoeba, highly, right? Now say it, E, you'll see that your tongue, because your mouth kind of pulls back and your tongue is way up high in the front of your mouth. E, okay? As opposed to what looks like the little capital I, is what you might have learned is that shallow I sound. Hit, income, definition, been for some speakers. Some people say been. I've been doing this, and some people say I've been doing this. Some people say I've been doing this. These are all slightly nuanced differences. Some people are better at hearing these differences than others. Some people are better at producing these differences than others. And what we're ultimately interested in doing is being able to take natural speech and describe it with these symbols, right? So for homework last week, to get started, we started with the, I don't want to say less challenging, the different exercise of starting with the IPA description and trying to connect it to the correct word, right? So the idea is that you start to recognize that each of these symbols represents a sound, and that by sounding it out, you should be able to come up with the word that is being described, right? So here we have w, o's. So that OW in the middle, remember that's a diphthong, O's, right? O's, woes. Okay, guide, right? Guide, right? That AJ, once again, is a diphthong. Say it in your head, right? Guide. Moth. You notice how that backwards C symbol makes a sound? Moth. And I love the theta, right? The theta is our regular TH, voiceless TH in English, moth. Pout, once again, the AW in this case is a different diphthong, pout. Change is a strange looking one, right? And so we start to recognize that while it is true that some symbols look a lot like the letters they end up representing in English, and that's because IPA was developed primarily by English speakers, it has to represent more sounds, and so it does that by using different symbols. So in this case, we have change with those first two symbols combined together to make the CH sound. Then we have a diphthong, the EJ symbols is the AE, right? Then the N symbol, right? And then the J at the end. So change. Voiced is our next one. We have a Y sound in the middle there, a glide, voiced. Right? Mirage. Right? We'll see here. We see our upside down R symbol there to represent the American sounding R. Some of you have problems with this one, and the next one, number 8, I think maybe it's because you aren't familiar with or don't use this kind of word, this word very often. But sachet, sachet can be a style of walking, or a sachet can be a little bag of smell good stuff that you stick in a drawer somewhere. The next one is dungeon, right? And in that case, you see a different vowel sound we haven't seen before, represented by what looks like an upside down V. And we have an interesting thing at the end there, which is that nasal N sound. And you'll notice that it has a little line below it. Oftentimes that line will be straight. It depends on the font, how it pops out, right? In this case, it looks like a little comma underneath it. But dungeon, that sound, almost it feels like it carries a syllable, right? Dungeon. It carries the vowel of that part of the sentence, the vowel sound. So it's one of those sonorant consonants, okay? The next one is breathing. That N sound that kind of drops down, looks like a J at the bottom. That's that NG sound, that we have a lot. Notice that they're not separate sounds, right? They're sounds that combine to make one sound. So they're separate letters, NG, that combine in this single sound, right? Next we have could. We finally had a simple one. But it's simple because it wants to point out, right, very clearly the difference between IPA transcription and spelling, right? There's lots of ways to spell words lots of ways to spell different sounds, right? So in this case, we have a C-O-U-D, could, right? And it's simpler in the IPA. We have feather. You'll notice that the R has a line, right? That means that it is sonorant, just like that N above it and like the L below it. So it's going to have the power of a syllable. Feather, right? And then finally we have universal, and some people are thrown off by this one because it begins with that symbol J. But remember that symbol J is a Y sound in English, one we associate with a Y at the beginning of words, like yes, right? Universal, we say universal. Don't say universal, right? We say universal. Also, I think there was a duplication error where I made the end of that word hard to read, so it's hard to see the S in there and the R maybe. So, keep working. And if you have questions, of course, send me an email. I am here to help.